optimal psychology and moral, faith, intellectual, and ethical development. Within optimal psychology, the nature of the upper stages of moral reasoning, faith, intellectual, and ethical development can be further clarified through an exemplification of the conceptual system on which their achievement depends. We begin with a discussion of the role of optimal psychology within the domain of orthodox Western psychology. Then, transpersonal psychology. Next, we examined the relationship among conceptual systems, behavior, and ethical standards by examining the concept of development in terms of nation behavior and cultural evolution. We shall act on our conclusions that we must move beyond the constraints of a suboptimal worldview by now looking at the higher stages of faith, moral, intellectual, and ethical development through a cognitive developmental approach, African-centered cognitive developmental approach. The theories, Kohlberg, and moral development. Lawrence Kohlberg argues that reasoning about moral issues occurs in a developmental sequence inasmuch as stages of moral development represent qualitatively different patterns of reasoning about moral norms, that is, life, law, legal justice, conscience, family affiliation, contract, and property. According to Gibbs, stages of development also represent new thought operations, internalized schemata of action, logically or philosophically formalized systems in equilibrium, and culturally universal patterns. Gibbs' views follow the stages of development theorized by Piaget. Kohlberg's stages of moral development represent a qualitatively different way of reasoning, occurring on a hierarchical sequence of 6 stages. To discern the developmental stage of moral reasoning, 2 or more conflicting norms, for example, commitment to family versus commitment to the law, are presented, and an individual is asked to make a decision about the action he or she would take, and then explain the decision. The explanation or reasoning behind the selection is the key to understanding the developmental stage of the individual. Kohlberg's classic Heinz dilemma is an example of such a juxtaposition. In this dilemma, the subject is asked to respond to the following situation. Heinz's wife is dying of cancer, and in their town is a druggist who has developed a drug to cure cancer. The drug costs more than Heinz can pay, and since Heinz cannot pay the druggist for his efforts in developing the druggist refuses to give it to him. Heinz does not want his wife to die. Should Heinz steal the drug to save his wife's life? An affirmative or negative response by the subject must be justified. Therein lies the key to understanding the subject's developmental stage. Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral development represent a progression in reasoning from simplistic ego-centered structure of the stage 1, doing right to avoid punishment, to stage 6 reasoning patterns that is based on the universal principles of justice and love. Martin Luther King's justification for the civil disobedience has been described as a stage 6 reasoning, inasmuch as King believed that certain universal principles of justice override the civil laws of a society or a subgroup. When civil law conflicts with universal principles, individuals must choose to follow the law or disobey it. According to its hierarchy, Stage 6 reasoning suggests that the universal principles of justice and love supersedes Kohlberg's stage 5 considerations of the just society. Kohlberg suggests the extension of his scheme to a 7th stage of moral reasoning, in which the individual would seek answers to such questions as, why be moral? Why live? In the 7th stage of reasoning, an individual seeks to understand his or her relationship to the world order of societies and humans and to the cosmos. Kohlberg states, its essence is the sense of being a part of a whole of life and adoption of a cosmic as opposed to universal humanistic stage 6 perspective. Here is diunital logic, the union of opposites at work. Universal law requires adherence, and morality is a necessary basis of life. Many researchers would suggest that because the upper stages of development are not empirically evident, they do not exist. However, in our society, where such high value is placed on a suboptimal epistemological process, empirical evidence of optimal reasoning would be scarce. I suggest that empirical evidence of an optimal system would not determine its nature or prove its existence. Fowler and faith development. James Fowler argues that faith development occurs within a developmental stage framework similar to Kohlberg's scheme. Fowler distinguishes faith from religious affiliation by referring to faith as an individual's orientation to an ultimate environment or what the individual feels to be the most important part of his or her life, while religious affiliations represent a commitment to a societal institution or set of values. This point is analogous to Kohlberg's distinction between moral reasoning as the justification for action, when two or more of the moral norms are juxtaposed, and morality as a set of values by which individuals choose to live. Both Fowler and Kohlberg see faith development and moral reasoning as developmental sequences distinguished from traditional faith and morality. Faith is more than just a religious affiliation with a particular societal organization, and morality is more than a set of individual values. Fowler defines the 6 stages of faith development. Similar to Kohlberg's stages of moral development, Fowler's stages represent qualitatively different ways of reasoning about faith. The stage definitive aspects include locus of authority, symbolic and conceptual functioning, role-taking, and extensiveness of identification and prototypical challenges with which faith must deal. Fowler's stages represent a progression from stage 1 faith development, dependence on and deference to parents, surrogates, family, authority figures, to stage 6 faith development, universalizing faith, in which the individual becomes aware of the ultimate context of life and seeks to integrate his or her being through a sense of the cosmic. Individual functioning at stage 6 transcends apparent conflicts within society, understanding the role of these conflicts play in the larger scheme of existence. In other words, opposites are unified, contained, and transcended through diunital reasoning. Conception of self affirms our multidimensional nature. Oneness is realized. Fowler's stages of faith development indicate the extensiveness of identification at each stage and how an individual would deal with role-taking. This brings us to the importance of understanding the parallels between faith and moral development. As an individual progresses through stages of faith and moral development, Empathetic understanding broadens. Concern for moral justification is at first egocentric, thus ultimately includes considerations related to moral justification and the cosmic order. In faith development, role-taking begins with an extremely limited ability to take on the role of the other. It progresses, however, to taking on the roles of subgroups in society, and then transcending apparent conflicts between subgroups in recognition of an ultimate state of existence in which viewpoints are understood as expressions of the larger cosmos. This expanding ability in role-taking, a process of self-knowledge, is the key to understanding the parallel between moral and faith development and the shift in conceptual systems that occurs across stages of development. Perry and intellectual and ethical development. As we seek to apply optimal psychology, we find William Perry's work on intellectual and ethical development in college students helpful in explicating the higher dimensions of psychological development. Perry observed the development of students who had apparently been socialized from a suboptimal conceptual frame of reference. As we follow Perry's observations, we observe that it is necessary to switch conceptual systems to reach the upper stages of moral and faith development. Perry's forms of intellectual and ethical development in the college years describes 9 positions or stages of development extrapolated from interview data collected from college students, freshmen to seniors, who span several age groups. Through the inductive process, typical methods used to surmise developmental schemes, Perry's 9 positions of development assume a Piagetian structure. Each of the 3 positions of development is grouped in a subset of 3 positions: dualism, relativism, and commitment. These function as filters for processing information. Taylor describes the schemes of Perry's original work. Dualism. The first 3 positions are characterized by a dichotomous structure from which the world is viewed in absolute either-or terms. It is assumed that truth is known and information is processed to fall nearly into one of 2 categories, such as right and wrong, good or bad, and so on. Perceiving the world from one of the structures, the students view authority figures as the keepers of truth from whom he or she must learn. Thus, reliance on authority instead of one's own ideas becomes a method of learning and decision-making. In position one, the world is viewed through the structure that is free from conflict, as uncertainty is not perceived. Unable to imagine the existence of more than one answer to a question, everything is absolute. Truth is accepted from the authorities without question. They are always right. Position 2. In a limited fashion, diversity and alternate possibilities are recognized. Truth is known to the authorities, who now introduce uncertainty as a way of helping students learn to find truth on their own. Some authorities who do not seem to know all of the answers are, as a consequence of the dualistic structure, deemed wrong. Position 3. Some truths are not presently known, even by authorities. Uncertainty becomes more uncomfortable. Authorities cannot be expected to know all the answers. Confusion and anxiety push the student to hold tightly to the notion that the authority will lead the way to finding the truth in the future. In the next subset, relativism. In positions 4, 5, and 6, Knowledge is viewed as relative because of the dualistic structure is discarded in recognition of numerous possibilities. Uncertainty replaces absolutism. Authority is released from its all-knowing position as the student's ideas gain equal status. The search for the right answer is abandoned and dependent on the context. A variety of answers is considered. Position 4. Here begins the shift from uncertainty and reality perception. While in some areas truth remains, there are no answers or criteria by which to distinguish one's opinion or one opinion from the other. Learning focuses on thinking about thinking or practicing with their guidance the way of the authorities and the way they want us to think. Position 5. All knowledge is viewed as relative and contextual, as opinions can be judged better or worse depending on the existence of supporting evidence. Introspection and detachment are possible for the first time, and authorities are now only those who have experience and competence in groping for the truth within a given context. At the same time, the ability to evaluate and choose provokes the fear that one's opinions are being narrowed. Position 6. The acceptance of a relativistic world in which infinite context exists is accompanied by the realization that choosing is essential to avoiding disorientation. One must affirm self-identity by establishing a personal context. The need for commitment is recognized, but not yet acted upon. And the last subset of 3 stages is commitment in relativism. Characterized by the development of commitments, no restructuring occurs as it does in other positions. The individual takes responsibility for making choices and for affirming self-identity in many areas of life. That is the style and content of identity. So position 7, marking the point of initial commitment is in some aspect of life, such as career, relationships, or values. Commitment is based on a genuine exploration of alternatives. Commitment is initially viewed as something restoring some order to one's life. Position 8. Additional choices emerge regarding how to carry out initial commitments. The issues of responsibility and of a style within which to implement commitments becomes a major focus. With the acceptance of the infinite nature of choosing comes awareness of relativism in its fullest sense. Position 9. The integration of commitment and lifestyle is determined by implementation of commitments. Commitment is recognized as ongoing. If in our society, the college-educated represent the intelligentsia of our culture, we may assume the limited capacity of Perry's findings, which would exclude the population at large. For the college student, however, unless a conceptual system switch takes place, a commitment to relativism will not lead to the higher stages of moral and faith development. No restructuring occurs after the stages of relativism. Consequently, when the stages of development bypass the conceptual switch, answers and criteria by which to distinguish opinion is absent. The ability to evaluate and choose is feared as narrowing of options, and we must search for a context within which to affirm self-identity. While commitment restores order, the restoration is enhanced or limited by the quality of commitment. The absence of a basis for a standard of ethics is once again noted and very much needed. Piaget outlined 4 stages of cognitive or logical thought development. In the initial stage of development, sensory motor intelligence, the individual's behavior is primarily motor. It is believed that the child, age 0 to 2, does not think conceptually. Pre-operational thought, ages 2 to 7, is a period of language development, and the child begins to think conceptually. Logical thought is first applied to concrete problems in the stage Piaget calls concrete operations, age 7 to 11. Formal operational thoughts are the final period, the last stage of development. In this stage, ages 11 to 15, in which the individual begins to apply logic within various contexts of problem solving. Regardless of the age ranges that correspond to the levels of development identified by Piaget, studies show that much of the adult population falls within the concrete or formal operations reasoning structures. Reviewing the literature on formal operational thought in adults, King notes that it is apparent that a rather large proportion of adults do not evidence formal thinking, even among those who have been enrolled in college. It is necessary, however, to reach Piaget's 4th stage, formal operations, in order to also function within the parameters of Perry's relativism, not to mention the higher stages of Kohlberg's moral development and Fowler's faith development. We are beginning to see how the problems of reaching the higher stages of psychological development are compounded long before we approximate the upper reaches. By inherent limitations of the suboptimal worldview into which we have been socialized or are being socialized. Commitment to relativism itself may create a suffocating trap when we continue to see ourselves in the finite and limited terms of individual form and external criteria. Neither Fowler or Kohlberg claims to have provided a closed-ended developmental process of faith or moral development. Further stages of development may exist. These will have to be clarified through more theorizing and research. Our challenge, however, is to understand the nature of the upper stages of development and how they differ from the preceding stages in terms of philosophical assumptions and principles. Clarification will help us understand the developmental process. The optimal conceptual system is useful in comparing the philosophical assumptions of the developmental stages outlined by Fowler and Kohlberg. Albert defines a conceptual system as a pattern of beliefs and values that define a way of life and the world in which men and women act, judge, decide, and solve problems. Traditionally, Western social scientists and educators have recognized only one conceptual system, their own, the European-American one. That worldview based on the suboptimal conceptual system. However, as we have seen, other worldviews and conceptual systems exist, and we shall further our knowledge considerably as we take them into account. Ontological assumptions and their implications for moral and faith development form one of the most important differences between the suboptimal and optimal conceptual systems. The optimal conceptual system assumes that reality is at once spiritual and material. All things are interrelated. The material realm is merely that reality that is the most outward manifestation of the spiritual. This corresponds to the ontological assumption on which Kohlberg and Fowler based the upper stages of development. Optimal ontological assumptions fully integrate the human and transcendent, or in the moral development terms, the humanistic stage 6, and the cosmic stage 7 perspectives. On the other hand, the suboptimal view rests on the ontological assumptions that reality is primarily material, with only a secondary spiritual aspect. This premise correlates to the ontological assumptions that anchor the lower stages of moral and faith development, within which the individual seeks to construct a world based on parent, family, community, state, society, and nation ideas. Moral, faith, intellectual, and ethical development as the movement from the suboptimal to optimal. Progression across the stages of faith and moral development is a transition from the suboptimal to the more optimal conceptual system. The core philosophical concern, Kohlberg's theory of moral development and Fowler's theory of faith development, is the relationship between the self and other. Kohlberg asserts that one way of addressing or understanding the transformations that arise in the development of moral judgment is to view such transformations as relationships of society's roles and expectations to the self. In his earlier work, Kohlberg proposed that ego development or ego strength is an important dimension of moral character that serves as a bridge between moral judgment and moral behavior. Kohlberg suggests that certain features of ego development and ego structures are more general than and are embodied in moral structures. This self represents an individual's definition of life space or most relevant context of existence. Other represents an individual's unrealized or irrelevant context of existence. To the degree that an individual's conceptions of self and the other meld, higher stages of human development are realized. To the extent they are separated, they are not realized. Perceptual relationships of self to other changes throughout life. For example, inasmuch as the child is dependent on parents, the parents are the child's most relevant context of existence. As the child grows, the relevant context of existence is expanded to include friends, teachers, and others to whom the child looks for love, affiliation, and respect, and to whom the child may begin to feel some responsibility. The role, and indeed the definition, of the authority figure changes as the child's relevant context of existence expands through experience to include larger social groups, societal or cultural groups, the world as humanity, and ultimately the cosmos. As this development takes place, the definition of self expands, while the definition of other and a relevant context of existence diminishes. Definitions of self represent at first the finite and expands to the infinite as a sense of oneness is achieved. Initially, the suboptimal view of the world or of the self is egoistic, egocentric, and the ability to conceive of one's responsibility to family, community, nation, and world is limited. A sense of responsibility grows, however, as the sense of self broadens. This is supported by theories and research of Selman, Gibbs, and Keegan. Each researcher studied human growth from a similar theoretical perspective and supports the notion of an expanding context of responsibility as a primary dimension of life change. Operating from the optimal perspective, self is expanded to what Nobles calls the extended self. The extended self includes all of the ancestors yet unborn, all of nature, the entire community, and infinite self. An individual's perspective is not just personal. Kohlberg refers, in effect, to the expanded sense of self in his 1981 volume on moral development, when he describes the nature of a potential stage 7 of moral development. It is when we begin to see our lives as finite from some more infinite perspective that we feel. It is when we begin to see our lives as finite from some more infinite perspective that we feel despair. The meaninglessness of our lives in the face of death is the meaninglessness of the finite from the perspective of the infinite. The resolution of despair, which we call stage 7, represents a continuation of the process of taking on a more cosmic perspective, whose first stage is despair. It represents a shift from figure to ground. In despair, we are the self-seen from the distance of the cosmic or infinite. In the state of mind metaphorically termed stage 7, we identify ourselves with the cosmic or infinite perspective itself, the value of life from its standpoint. This description of the transition into a metaphorical stage 7 is congruent with our own viewpoint of the transition to an extended self, or transition from a suboptimal to an optimal conceptual system. In addition, such questions as why be moral, why live, and how should I face death are not unique to post-conventional stages of reasoning or the universalized stage of faith. Instead, we propose that these questions become the figure as opposed to the ground in light of the expanding sense of self and a diminishing sense of the other. Ultimately, figure and ground unify at the height of development. The unification of figure and ground, spiritual and material, human and transcendent, and humanistic and cosmic provide the basis for a cosmic or optimal conceptual system. Kohlberg's 7th stage and Fowler's 6th stage of development represent the full evolution of an individual within an optimal conceptual system, as can be rendered within a Euro-Western cultural framework. Preliminary implications for education and psychology. The educational implications of optimal psychology for moral, faith, and intellectual and ethical development are far-reaching. Now, in addition to moving through the stages in the traditional way, a broader educational context within which we are actually taught to examine our belief systems are introduced to an alternative and explore the consequences of both for daily experience and how they can be envisioned. We shall discuss such an approach in terms of psychotherapy, belief systems analysis, and education. Educational systems can utilize this information by assuming a more holistic approach to knowledge and realizing the important role the conceptual system plays in the generation and assimilation of knowledge and in moral and faith development. Also, in part 3, we will elaborate the relevance of the optimal conceptual system in contemporary life and family function. From the framework of an optimal psychology, several specific recommendations are in order. 1, stress cosmology as an overriding framework in which technical information and skills can be made more meaningful. 2, use the spiritual material worldview toward which modern physics is pointing as a mechanism for making a cohesive, unified reality evident in day-to-day functioning. 3, continue to illustrate the interconnectedness of all things by pointing out their interrelationships. 4, establish another area of dialogue about which the role of identity and self-worth in human interaction and development exists. 5, explore the worldview of various cultures and the ramifications of identifiable differences. 6, emphasize the similarities of various conceptual systems, examining their manifestation and maintenance within the context of history. 7, encourage creativity by suspending previously imposed suggestions of restriction and limitation. And 8, establish a standard of ethics that is entirely internally consistent. The link established by optimal psychology between the later stages, higher stages of moral faith and intellectual and ethical development makes the implementation of these recommendations not only feasible, but essential. Myers discusses in great detail the importance of an Afrocentric worldview for pluralism and education in our society. Clearly, an interprofessional model of education would manifest a move toward optimal higher education. In interprofessional education, the classroom would provide the context for the examination of specialized knowledge by students and specialists from a variety of disciplines. In such an educational system, faculty and students would be taught the skills of examining their belief systems and the belief systems of others in order to come to professional decisions that would benefit everyone and society as a whole. Collaboration, not competition, would be the professional focus. Thank you. I am ending for today, and we'll pick up part 3, proven through practice, at our next offering. That will be on page 67. Welcome to our conversation today. Our focus will be on understanding an Afrocentric worldview, introduction to an optimal psychology, and this week we will focus on chapter 6, which is optimal psychology, moral, faith, intellectual, and ethical development. And this is such an important topic. When I wrote about it at the time, very concerned about what researchers were saying relative to the status of Euro-Western culture. And Dr. Garvey and I today will discuss some of the points that they made. At that time, whether it was Kohlberg talking about moral development, or Fowler talking about faith development, or Perry talking about intellectual and ethical development, they all had to concede that the culture was very limited and underdeveloped in these arenas. Now, being mindful this was the late 80s, I don't know that we've become more developed, but we're certainly seeing the fruits of the undevelopment with the kind of things that are going on in the country today. Your thoughts, Dr. Garvey?
Well, I don't think anything has changed in terms of the European worldview over the last, let's say, 1,000 years. Certainly we know it hasn't changed over the last 500 years, because we know that they've gone from enslaving people to colonizing people to this concept of globalization, which is really reaping or raping the resources of the world to satisfy the needs, shall we say, no, it shouldn't be needs, should satisfy the wants of a few, so that the wealth of the universe is concentrated in the hands of about, the top 5% of the people, 100% of the wealth of the universe. So nothing has really changed. And I think it's important, though, to look at the method of socialization in terms of the culture itself, because that is what produces the individual, and then of course that's what produces the society. How does society replicate itself? It replicates itself through an educational and socialization process. And the education is the spearhead of that, but also, the religion in terms of what the religious beliefs are, in terms of, again, the belief systems of the particular group. And, if you look at the Western ideology, well, first of all, I think you have to, whatever group of people that you look at, it's always a group of individuals. So we have to start with, in some sense, with the individual. Now, I think in terms of Western culture, it begins and ends with the individual. The individual is a standalone entity, and the individual is based on, shall we say, mind and body, meaning that the individual has certain sensory organs that brings information from the outside world, if you will, to this mind, which is located in the brain, because it's considered that mind and brain are the same. So and the entity derived from this mind-body complex is really the ego. The individual is the ego. So everything in the West is an ego-based psychology, in terms of functioning of the individual. The individual then has an intellect, which is what mind is considered to be, and pretty much in its totality. It then utilizes the information that's brought from the outside by the five senses, and it uses it then to create an environment so that the ego can be satisfied based on pleasure. The ego seeks pleasure as opposed to pain, and or is indifferent because it doesn't matter. So those are the three things: pleasure, pain, or ignoring what is there. And ignoring also means ignorance or stupidity, because it means you're not aware of what's going on. So we have the pleasure principle and the avoidance of pain. So pleasure is desire and wanting things and grasping things and clinging to things and trying to make things happen. This is what that is all about, for the benefit of ego. Or in terms of avoiding things, in terms of pain, you avoid things that you dislike or are painful, and you're afraid of them, or you're angry about them, or you destroy them, or whatever. So those are the responses based on this ego identity. It's desire and pleasure, or it's pain and avoidance and fear, etc. And this we see, manifested, and not just individual, because then the individual makes up the society. And you can see that the society then is an acquisitive society. And because it's made up of these isolated individuals who all want to acquire, it's therefore a competitive society. And therefore it's a society that is in conflict with itself. And I'll just stop there a little bit and contrast it with an African society, if you will, that is made up of individuals, but the individual is not a standalone individual because it's not based on just mind body. It's based on spirit. And this is the important thing about the difference, because spirit is something that unites us all, because the spiritual basis of the individual is also the spiritual basis or the basis of reality. And of course, nowadays, the Indians call it the Akashic field, if you will. We call it Amun in terms of that, or Nu and Nonet, or in terms of our Kemetic civilizations. But the basis of the individual is spirit, and spirit is identical with source, which is source for everything. So the individual is not disconnected from other individuals or from the society. And the individual finds his expression, shall we say, or meaning within the relationships with other individuals, as family, as community, as nation, as tribe. So that meaning derives from relationships.
Absolutely.
Meaning does not derive from acquisition.
Very different, very, very different. And I think the reality of which you speak certainly reflects the fact that that suboptimal view, wherever they got it, however they got it, is not changed, probably isn't going to change. But I think the opportunity for African people and those who are desirous of a different reality, the opportunity for them to go back and fetch and adopt that optimal worldview of their ancestral heritage is probably needed now more than ever, because as we're looking at what's going on in society, I think this chapter more than anything lets us know we really can't depend on following people who have never advanced probably a tenth of the level to which we as African people have culturally. And I loved what you said, Dr. Garvey, about the individual and the collective, because in optimal psychology, we talk about the multidimensional self. My sense of self cannot be separate from those who came before my ancestors or those who will come after, future generations, or nature or community. That's who I be. And as my being becoming, I'm interested in my being becoming more knowledgeable, gaining more wisdom, more understanding about all those dimensions, particularly in light of how I can best facilitate our growth and development to conscious realization of who we are as divine spirit. So it's such a different way of being in the world, and one to which I think we cannot get back to quickly enough, particularly as we look at the things required for that kind of reality, and not the least of which is our capacity to deal in truth. And we know in this social context, some in leadership would even argue there's no such thing as truth. It isn't a matter of whether a thing is true, it's whether or not you can get people to believe it. Which leads us to the whole issue of the imperative that we use our own minds to create that which we desire and not rely on the culture, because the culture we find ourselves in as people acknowledging African ancestry is toxic and pathological and can only lead to, well, not just lead humanity to destruction, because there is no moral grounding and no capacity or limited capacity for moral reasoning.
The tragedy about that, Linda, is that we, as a people, to a significant degree, have bought into that suboptimal psychology and suboptimal worldview, because it is the dominant worldview, and it has been dominant because we have been conquered. The tragedy is that we've said something about this. We've been disconnected from our past. But the tragedy is that, many of us talk about equality, saying that we want to be considered equal within that society that has been created by the suboptimal worldview. Within that society and that philosophy and that psychology and that economic system that has enslaved our people, colonized our people, killed millions of our people, and continue to oppress us.
That's true.
But we want to be equal within that system. Now, that is, well, I'm going to say the height of madness, but since I'm talking, you have to say if maybe it's neurotic at least. Can we say it's neurotic? Even if we don't want to say it's psychotic. But obviously, if there's a significant mental problem there, and we get back to my dad who says, liberate your mind from mental slavery, and this is it. Our minds have been enslaved by the propaganda of this system that, how shall I say, that spreads the propaganda that this is the way human beings should behave.
And I felt the formal education.
Objectively, it's the way humans should not behave. How can you try to achieve peace by creating war and killing people? I mean, you have to be peace. You have to put peace on the table. You can't put war on the table and then think you're going to come away with peace. I mean, again, that's crazy. We have so many of these crazy things, And if you look at the young people today and you see what they're doing, many are committing suicide or they're shooting people, and they don't know what to do with themselves. Why? Because they've been brought up, with the TV, or they've been brought up with the cell phone. As you and I know, that they sit around and all they're doing is their only companion is that cell phone. And what's on the cell phone? It's games or porn or some other nonsense that's influencing their minds.
Definitely violence.
So the whole socialization is deviant in terms of what it teaches in terms of what a human being should be. Yes. And the other thing about it is that there's a lack of understanding on, quote, their part, but also on our part, that we are natural products. We are products of nature. And nature is one, but it's a oneness that is a oneness in diversity, so that the diversity is interconnected and intercommunicates. And we're created that way.
So true.
We're created to manifest what we're created as, just like the oak grows from the seed. You put the seed in the soil and you water it, and you get a mighty oak tree.
Yes.
The human being is born, and then it manifests those human qualities that are intrinsic. You don't need to manufacture them. They are intrinsic to you as a human being if they're allowed to develop. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the things that is overlooked. That, instead, and we go back to education and we look at the etymology of the word education, and it's educare, to bring out of. What is it you're supposed to bring out of? You're supposed to bring out of that human being that natural spiritual goodness and wonderfulness and creativity that is intrinsic to the human being. Mm-hmm. Just like the oak tree is intrinsic to the oak seed. But that is missing from all of these philosophies and the people that you mentioned and so on, Kohlberg and what have you. And I would say all of them miss this point completely. They think
Absolutely.
morals and ethics are something that you have to create, and that you have to school somebody in, and that you can deviate from by being tricky, yeah, or you can deviate from it because the other guy is doing it. You know, like I was watching a movie last night, and people were lying and cheating and stealing and so on. Of course, this was, the British versus the Russians, and the communists, and the capitalist system, and the bad guys and the good guys. And the good guys are saying, well, we have to behave like the bad guys because the bad guys are doing it. A rationalization that you can get around the system, because it's a system that has been created.
And I think that's
go into this whole business now. Let's change the system. And a lot of us look and say, well, we need a revolution, or we must change the system. That must change. We need to change the individual. We need to go back to what is the individual, and the individual. When what is individual is educated or brought out of the individual, then you'll have the system that you need. It's not going to be by an external revolution that sits down and changes the system and so on and says, okay, now we have a better system. This looks good on paper. Let's go out there and behave this way.
When we realize our oneness as a collective diversity, and we become mindful of how we treat our oneness and our diversity, we don't allow the kind of missocialization that's so commonplace. I remember early on when people were doing research on television, and the concern was, well, now you're programming people with unfiltered information that's going into their unconscious, if not conscious, and it will play out. It's energy. It's not just going to dissipate. It's now stuck there, and it's going to become a driver at some point until somebody does some sort of critical analysis or there's a discussion. Most times there's not. And so now, rather than move toward a system where we now teach people to think critically and deeply and become self-reflective, we just bombard people with even more. So social media now is really, really playing a trick on people, putting out images that are leading to what we're seeing, which is increased suicide among children and young adults, and mass killings, and just all kinds of insanity, if you will, because the intellectual development and capacity of the larger social context, of the cultural context, of that cultural worldview does not allow support of those things needed to bring out the best in the human. It really serves to bring out the worst of the human condition, and really socializes people to move from their lower consciousness because of the materialism and pain and pleasure principle that you spoke of.
And what is interesting about that too is the psychology and the general society changes definitions and quotes enlarges freedoms to accommodate dysfunctions, things that are dysfunctional.
Yes.
So now we have, that's now acceptable. Skirts used to be at the ankle, then they're below the knee, then they're above the knee. And now you don't wear a skirt, you wear a bikini or whatever it is, and that's acceptable. And we won't even get into the whole gender business, but we know that goes from left to right, and everything in between is, quotes, acceptable, because we live in a free democratic society where all you have to do is rename it, and then somehow it becomes acceptable. Yeah. And our psychologists, they are busy about making people comfortable within the society as it exists. So that's what they're, shall we say, manipulating the psyche so that it is at ease with the contradictions and with the fear and with the anxiety and with the desire and with the greed and all of these things that develop based on the systemic culturalization in a materialistic direction, where there's really no value system, because the value system changes every day.
None.
And the psychiatrist then help you to accommodate to the changes in the value system.
Absolutely true. In fact, they call it democratic sanity. If most people do it, then it's healthy or it's okay.
I like that. Yeah.
And that probably would be true if there was
as you were saying, it's a matter of opinion, right? It's not that this is the way it is. It's the opinion. It's my opinion that this is right. There's no such thing as truth. If 8 people say this is true, then it must be true.
It must be
true. It's a statistical truth. It's no longer a moral truth or an absolute truth. It's a statistical truth.
It is. Well, think about political correctness is a thing. Nobody's worried about being morally correct as long as I'm politically correct, or as I look correct, then it's okay. And I think what's so troublesome to me, Dr. Garvey, is how we as African people who come from a very different tradition just get so sucked in, not realizing that these people who we're chasing after to become like, to be accepted and equal to, have started out from the wrong place. There's never been a time when this so-called democracy has been based on truth. It started with a lie. A lie of Black inferiority, the lie that Black people were less than human, the lie that they are the moral leaders of the universe. Anything starting on a false foundation, the ontological premise about the nature of reality itself, nothing can be built on that. That is going to be solid. That's going to lead to humanity's upliftment and evolution in the right direction. It just cannot. But it's so hard because now if you're part of the formal educational system, you're probably not going to be exposed to how that's a fallacy. You're probably going to get just the opposite. You're going to get the idea, oh, you should fight to become equal. And in actuality, you should fight to elevate those who are in leadership to become equal to you.
The flip side of it is, and that's why it has continued for so long, that trying to escape or to be different from the system that's valorized, there are punishments. When you speak out and you say, I'm not going along with the system, or I believe the system is not beneficial for me, I'm creating my own system, or I'm basing my behavior on a different way from what you are, and I have these particular reasons, and so on and so forth, then you're either marginalized or you are sought out for punishment. And this is true over and over and over. And of course, the maximum punishment is assassination. And we know that has happened to so many of our leaders, Martin Luther King and so many others. And of course, it happens to people in the street all the time. But definitely those who stand up and say, I think the system should change. And that's where Martin Luther King, of course, got in trouble. It was bad enough that he was, trying to deal with civil rights. But when he talked about the atrocities that were being committed overseas in terms of Vietnam, and that the treasure of the nation was being wasted over there instead of dealing with the problems that were at home and were systemic, and went right back to the founding of the nation. And therefore, we all had a business to transform the society, not to accept it as it is and try to influence other people overseas. That was a bit much for the system to tolerate. So the system did away with him. And of course, I don't know that we know the truth and we never know the truth of so many of these things because, you know, it happened to Malcolm and so on. And of course, they were able to get rid of my dad in terms of false charges and imprisonment and then a deportation. So, you know, they find ways to marginalize you or to destroy you. And certainly within this country, you know, there's been the FBI and there's the CIA and there's a whole set of agencies that do these things, the dirty tricks departments. So that's why it's so hard for us to really stand on our own 2 feet and be independent in terms of our identity of who we are as a people and talk about, you know, the African American being essentially a nation within a nation. Mm-hmm. The Indian nation is a nation within the nation of America. You know, of course, you know, they're in basically imprisoned in their own country, shall we say. But they do have a national identity. Some of them hold on to it. You know, those of us who consider ourselves an African American nation in and of itself with an identity. Again, those people have been marginalized. Those people have been attacked because you stand out from what's considered the norm, and the system feels as if it's being attacked. And this is true within the country, and it's true outside of the country. And that's why the country is continually at war. It's at war internally, and it's at war externally. And there can never be peace.
That's true.
Because it always wants to do away with anybody who has a different opinion. And the reason for that is the insecurity of the identity as an ego, because ego has no basis.
None.
It's just a thought. It's a conception. It's an idea of self as an ego, as me versus you, or as me separate and apart from a thing. It is us or me versus them. It's just an idea in the mind. The true.
So that's why you can get people to buy into the idea there is no truth. If I can get you to believe a thing, then it's true. And in this social context, that's been the reality. If I can get you to believe in it, if I can get you to believe your worth and value is how you look, your skin color, where you live, your income, your education, your position, if I can get you to believe that and I can control your access to those things, I control you. Mm-hmm. And the ultimate price, as you point out, if you speak out against that, has historically been death. And I think that's, again, another reason to look at this alternate, optimal construction of reality in the wisdom tradition of our ancestors who understood there is no death. You can kill my body, but you can't kill my spirit, my soul, and I will be back. I will be back. And I love what your father said. Look for me in the whirlwind. It's me. I will be back. So somehow the only way to transcend the control and the fear that they've sought deliberately to instill is to transcend the consciousness that they've also tried to instill, which is you are this individual form, this ego, and once it's gone, you're gone. No. Again, the height of their science says seemingly that soul, that spirit, that consciousness, which you have in the body, is with you before you're born. And it's with you after your body's gone. So it's going to be very hard for people to break out of that false ontological premise that reality is essentially a 5 sense phenomena. No, reality is a spiritual phenomena, an energy phenomena. Energy does not and cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed.
You know, I think what you have said is of prime importance in terms of getting from step 1 to step 2, meaning that the consciousness, our consciousness has been conditioned to believe in the system and the rewards of the system. And we have to break out of that consciousness. And we have to understand basically that there are two consciousnesses. And it's interesting, our ancestors speak of them as Ausar and Auset. Those are the two consciousnesses. Ausar is basically the consciousness that connects us to the universal consciousness, to God, to the one consciousness. And Auset is the consciousness that connects us to the physical world. And that can get conditioned because it is basically Auset that ends up conditioning mind, meaning creating ego, as well as what we call mind in the smaller sense, meaning that which perceives things and labels things and gives them names and compares things and so on. So in order then to get to Ausar, to get to that universal consciousness, which is truly who we are, we have to decondition the consciousness that has been conditioned. And again, there's a system that was started, 6,000 years ago. And it has been around the world and in many places. It's called Buddhism, or it's called the Samkhya philosophy, or it's called Taoism, etc. And as a matter of fact, it's even called Christianity. But of course, it has come to us in distorted through historical circumstances, cultural transmissions, linguistic transmissions, and so on. So those of us who who have been brought up Christian and identify with that need to understand the source for their Christianity and need to understand how Christianity has changed from its source through the Gnostics or the Greek or Roman Hebrew times and has come to us through the West, through Rome, through England, and through American evangelism, and has come to us, and we have accepted it. We need to go back through it and deconstruct it to see the roots, because the roots are in Africa.
Yeah, absolutely true. In fact, one of the most interesting studies I've been involved in has been tracing the language from the Egyptian constructions to the what would it be, the Jewish, what am I trying
The Kabbalah, the Hebrew Kabbalah.
Yeah, the Hebrew, and then to the Latin, and on up to the English. And what you find is that with each translation, what's left out is the divine feminine, because Aset raised Heru to become Asar. So that her role, her awareness to do that, then is translated in ancient text. But once the Hebrew text comes along, they still acknowledge the feminine. But by the time it gets translated into Latin, much less English, it's gone. It's male. That feminine. And I'm not thinking of feminine as being restricted to women. All human beings have masculine and feminine energies and principles. But the idea that consciousness, which is divine, first manifest in the end awareness, at least according to the Nubian Kemetic text, from the feminine, from the female, is to be lost, or cannot be lost, because what we're up against now is the clear white male patriarchy that is total deception and manipulation and ego.
Yeah, the feminine, of course, is there at the birth of the universe. Amun, Mut, and Khonshu. Mut is the mother of the world,
Yes.
and Amun is the father of the world, and Khonshu is the whole universe that was created by this mother of the world. And the thing is that um, it is difficult. It's hard work, but each of us has a responsibility for our own. You might say salvation, or you can use the word enlightenment, or you can use the word liberation, because it has to be done individually, and it has to be done by the individual. And again, we go back to my father saying that, nobody but yourself can free your mind. Nobody can free it for you. So you cannot create a system that can liberate your mind. Whatever system is created, you still are the one that has to liberate your mind. Like we have talked about, basically an Afrocentric system that's out there. It's been there for 6,000 years. But there's no way you can rub it on top of your head or inject it into your body or something like that, and then it changes you or your mind and you become a different person. No, it's your responsibility. And how do you do that? You have to look at your mind. In other words, it's self-inquiry. That's where you get down to. It's self-knowledge. You have to develop self-knowledge. You can only develop self-knowledge through self-inquiry. And then you have to have self-discipline, you have to have self-control, and until you get to that stage where you understand yourself.
Yes.
And it's understanding, it's not the kind of book knowledge that we're talking about. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's not about necessarily just reading a book on whatever the system is, whether it's a Christianity or the Old Testament or Hebrew book or Buddhist book or Taoist book or whatever. It's not about just reading a book. It's about that process of understanding, of self-inquiry, self-knowledge, and self-insight, and therefore self-understanding, which is
kind
the
of
process that each one of us has to undertake. Yes.
it's kind of where we started with this notion of edukare and being human. We're born with the connect. We came with the connection. It's our true identity. It's who we really are. It's just that it's been hidden from us by a social context that wants us to believe we're something else that's not that. So I always suggest, based on optimal psychology, be still and know.
Yes.
Sit down, get quiet, be still, contemplate that divinity within you and let it lead you. It's powerful. It's a powerful instructor, educator, and leader. And while when you go about it that way, Dr. Garvey, my experience has been it's not you alone. It is you at one with all that is. And that's such a shift, because then you're not constantly looking outside yourself to read something or be told something. What you're finding is there's a knowing you have, and you might look around and be happy that somebody else knows it too, or someone else has written about it, or someone else is affirming what you've known. But it's more of an inside out process than an outside in.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. It is an inside out process. But as we've been saying, most of us live on the outside. In other words, we're superficial people who deal with things out there that are brought to us by our senses, and we deal with those things. And we have very little, if any, internal dialogue with ourselves. And this is what we're talking about. Now, I think this can be done systematically in terms of, you might almost say, intellect, in terms of self-inquiry, in terms of understanding what mind is and how mind functions. That's very much almost an intellectual process in terms of looking at oneself. It can also be done not so much intellectually, but shall we say at the conscious energetic level, which I think is what you have just been talking about. And that's why there are different strokes for different folks, because some people find it easier to do one thing or another thing. There are also other processes, such as, what has been called tantra in terms of Buddhist spirituality, that, meaning that you do a lot of visualization, etc., to get you to where you want to be. And the visualization, shall we say, is symbolic of what it is that you're trying to accomplish in terms of your own internal, dialogue. You're seeing yourself as how you want to be. That's what the visualization process is, so that you're sort of short-circuiting it, as opposed to simply looking at yourself where you are at the present time, and dismantling that in terms of a deconstructive process. And then over time, you get to where you want to be, or where you should be, or where you actually are without knowing it. Because as you mentioned before, the problem is not so much who we are, it's just that we have forgotten who we are, or we have not known who we are, because we've been deceived in terms of thinking that we're this, or we're that, or we should be this, or we should be that, and we should accumulate this, and that's our identity. No, we have an identity that's intrinsic, but we have not known it, or we have forgotten it, and it has been covered over. And then the process that we're talking about now is unpacking who we really are, and getting rid of all of these conditioned mental, psychic additions or transformations to our basic consciousness energy that we are as an entity, which is a universal entity that is manifesting on the physical plane through us as a physical human being.
So very true. And however you get there,
Yes,
just get there if you can.
By bus, by train, by plane. No place how you can walk. A bicycle.
And so we're just wanting to create this space where people can think about all the different ways to get to who we really are, so we can really be and fulfill the potential that we came to fulfill. And I am so grateful to you for this conversation, and we'll look forward to a conversation again next week as we try to
go further down the trail to find out.
Yes.
Appreciate it, Linda.
Yes, thank you all so very much.
Take care.